Okay, we are now live, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are around the world. Now, this is the first Music Ally TV show of the year. This is episode 19. I'm Joe Sparrow here in a particularly cold Berlin. And this week, this show, we've got a topic that we've been trying to organize for a long time and really looking forward to this show. We're talking about making the music industry environmentally sustainable. We're going to be talking education, innovation, and taking learnings from other industry initiatives. We'll be talking the structural, technical, and behavioral changes that can happen. We'll look at case studies from past work from our panelists that they've undertaken, and we'll talk about the hidden environmental impact of technologies like, for example, music streaming, and the business opportunities that thinking sustainably can and will provide. Now, guests, we have three today. You can see two on the screen with me at the moment. We're thrilled to welcome Dr. Alan Hershkowitz, environmental scientist, visionary, activist, writer, lecturer, and strategic sustainability advisor. For 26 years, Alan served as senior scientist at the Natural Resource Defense Council. He created the environmental program for the GRAMMY Awards, helped pioneer market-based environmental responsibility, guiding the sustainability programs of corporations like the Warner Music Group, the NBA, HBO, Disney, Pepsi, and Coca-Cola, a rare duo there, I would say, and numerous other firms. I'm underselling him a bit here because he's done so much. I recommend that you check his or Google his name and see what you can find. So Alan, thank you very much for joining us, and good morning to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, absolutely. This is, right now, we're undermining the functional integrity of the biosphere, the ecosystem services on which all business depends on, all life depends. So this is a really important conversation. And frankly, the music industry in particular is a particularly important platform because outside of the family, the most influential role models are athletes and entertainers. What we really need, the single most important thing that we could do to advance environmental intelligence, to advance sustainability, is instigate a cultural shift in our attitudes, cultural shift in our expectations about how we relate to the planet. How should we relate to the ecosystems that give us water to drink? How should we relate to the ecosystems that give us air to breathe? We're treating the atmosphere like a sewer. Every day we dump 100 million tons more than 100 million tons of global warming pollution into the atmosphere every single day. We've already raised the temperature of the planet. We are literally on a path. This might sound extreme, but frankly, the new concept that people are talking about is human extinction event. If we keep going the way we're going, the temperature of the planet, we're going to blow through 2 degrees increase in temperature globally compared to pre-industrial levels. We get to 3 degrees, we get to 4 degrees, we get to 5 degrees. You're talking about basically, serious. I mean, we're already facing catastrophic impacts. Hundreds of thousands of people die already every year from climate-related impacts. Literally hundreds of billions of dollars of economic damages are occurring every year. Literally tens of millions of environmental refugees, people who have lost their homes due to storms, droughts, sea level rise, coastal erosion. Whether you're talking about the chemistry of the atmosphere, whether you're talking about the chemistry of the ocean acidification, plastics pollution, trillions of pieces of plastics in the ocean dumped every year, whether you're talking about the proliferation of wastes, literally tens of billions of tons of waste. So we have an urgent ecological issue. And while, when I started this work decades ago, when I started to work with the Oscars and the Academy Awards and the Grammys back in the early 2000s, I was working with some visionary people who felt it was the right thing to do. And that was the case. But now it's more than just the right thing to do. It is an essential business obligation. There is a new management obligation in the 21st century corporation that relates to sustainability. Investors are looking at the environmental liabilities of companies, especially publicly traded companies or large visible companies. Consumers expect environmental intelligence built into the way a business operates. Companies are looking to avoid their branding liabilities. There's market expansion opportunities if you could outcompete your competitor based on your environmental progress.
Yeah.
So it's really an urgent, the Harvard Business Review, the World Economic Forum, it's a critical business obligation now. And frankly, there's, a lot, you talk about sustainability. Let's just, first of all, for those who are, let's just remind people what that means. Sustainability, sustainable development was a term coined in the late 1980s at a UN conference, but it basically means engaging in culture, engaging in commerce today in such a way so that future generations have an equal availability of ecological services, that future generations have an equal availability of clean air or clean water or a chemically stable atmosphere or healthy soil. Well, the question is, how do you engage in such a way today so that future generations have an equal availability of ecological services when every day there's another 225,000 people on the planet? Every 6 weeks, there's another New York City's worth of population on the planet. So population is increasing. And I don't want to get, formulaic or technical, but, environmental impact equals population times consumption times technology. So we have population that is increasing, consumption is increasing, personal consumption, government consumption is going up by double digits, and we're still overwhelmingly wedded to environmentally ignorant fossil fuels. So, in that context, we really need to turn things around. And I have to tell you that there is no one big answer to this issue. To the point about the music industry in particular, there is nothing too small to matter. I would quote Mother Teresa, who said that there are no great things. We cannot do great things, only little things with great love. And that's, I'm literally working on, large energy systems down to the plastic straw. Everything matters.
Thank you, Alan. I mean, that's a really good overview of the urgency of this and also the sort of diffuse nature of the issue. But that also brings us to how the music industry can play a role in a couple of different ways, which also brings us to Mike Jabara. Hi, Mike, CEO of MQA Audio Technology. And before that was corporate EVP of technology at Warner Music Group, if I'm right, which is a place where you were also quite active. And you've long been active and outspoken in making changes at business level that drive environmental sustainability. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Mike, I must point out, and MQA are long-term supporters of Music Ally, particularly in China and Japan. And we're very grateful to have you joining us today.
Thanks, Joe. And we've really enjoyed our relationship with Music Ally. Very grateful that Alan was able to make time to join us today. A little quick background is, we've been friends since 1997. In fact, most of the things that I'll be talking about today are things that I was able to execute on with Alan as my guide, and in many cases, Alan as kind of a corporate guide. So we first met, it was actually, he was my next door neighbor. And the day that we moved in, he showed up on my front porch with 2 6-packs, and we stood in my kitchen and got to know one another.
The ideal neighbor, yeah.
He, in so many ways, and that began my education. The early days of our life together were things like me learning about open space preservation, conservation easements, understanding why biomass and carbon sequestration and things like that really mattered. He was very active in our local community as well as being the senior scientist at the NRDC. We did a lot together in that way, and he really put it in my ear that we should be driving more change in our respective day jobs. And so I had the good fortune of being able to introduce him to my boss at the time, John Esposito. Not surprisingly, for those that know John Esposito, who now runs Warner Nashville, he was already quite engaged himself in the NRDC. And so the first meeting was kind of a love affair, and a lot of great things came from that. And we'll talk about some of those today, but I'm grateful. And as it relates to MQA, and as you said, I was at Warner for about 20 years. MQA for me is not just an exciting professional opportunity because of the innovation that the technology of MQA represents. It's an audio technology company based in the UK, but it also has a direct connection to a more sustainable music industry future. I won't get into all of the details of how MQA does what it does, but it's a very unique audio technology that provides the highest quality playback of original audio, whether it's live or pre-recorded, but it does it in a highly efficient way. And that's because our engineering team has decades of experience in managing lossless audio and packaging it very efficiently. And some of the things that we've done really break many of the rules about how traditional digital audio was represented for decades. And so we get a superior experience for a much smaller footprint. In fact, we started with our partners to socialize how their use of MQA translates into a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, because the energy consumption through the use of MQA has a direct effect on this topic. But I'll stop there, Joe, and let you take back over. But there's some.
That's okay. Well, we'll talk about that in a while,
yeah,
about the footprint of data transfer. But yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. And just so you know how this session is going to work, in about 35 minutes, Mike and Alan will finish, and we have a third guest, Chiara Badiali from Julie's Bicycle, the UK not-for-profit organisation that works with arts and creative industries to navigate environmental sustainability. And we're going to be talking about with her very specific actions that you, the viewers, can take to get started. So, well, let's move straight on. Alan, you gave a very sort of succinct overview of the situation we face, and perhaps people watching might have felt something similar to what perhaps big businesses might feel, which is this feeling of being overwhelmed when faced with the challenge of initiating change. Now, you've said about how individuals can, you say, make small steps with big intentions, but when we talk about major corporations, and you've worked with many of them, including enormous sports teams and organizations and the Grammys, as you said, how can major corporations get past that feeling of being overwhelmed and start making positive change? How do you get over that hurdle?
Yeah, well, okay, let me say a couple of things. First of all, with regards to the environmental issue, and please, listeners and viewers, just bear with me. I'm about to say something that may make you feel uncomfortable, but it is true. And that is that global warming is not a resolvable issue in our lifetime, okay? Cleaning up the plastic from the ocean, dealing with ocean acidification, it's not going to be remedied in our lifetime. Deforestation is going to be a challenge that we're going to have to deal with and manage forever. Okay, in the same way that we have been dealing with gender bias and structural racism for centuries, the ecological challenges that we face today are enormous. We're talking about tremendously big numbers and large landscapes, and we're talking literally at a planetary level. However, when you get before your maker, she's not going to ask if you solved global warming, okay? I think what she's going to ask is, how did you spend your time? What did you try to do? So this is just because this is a long ball game, pardon the pun. I created the environmental programs at Major League Baseball and at the NBA and, most sports organizations. I work with the International Olympic Committee. So, basically every sector is now engaged in paying attention to sustainability. But so that you don't burn out, okay, just recognize that every little thing matters and that we are here to keep the movement going. We're still fighting for voting rights. There's more slaves in the world today than there were 100 years ago, okay? We still have structural racism. So, we have to just keep this going. That being said, from the corporate perspective, let me offer you, some very simple concepts for you to think about. By the way, first and foremost, right now, recently I was the co-chair of an international advisory board with the former Surgeon General of the United States dealing with health and safety protocols at sports and entertainment venues. So let me just acknowledge the fact that right now, the number one issue at the sports and entertainment sector, certainly this is true for the London West End, it's true for Broadway, it's true for Live Nation, it's true for AEG, who has over 300 venues around the world, it's true for baseball, basketball, hockey, football, is the COVID. Okay, everybody is paying attention right now to the health impacts of their immediate surroundings. And remember, ultimately, this is about life. What we're dealing with, whether we're dealing with planetary health or we're dealing with human health, we're dealing with preservation of life. And right now, one of the greatest risks to us is the health impacts of our surroundings. So before I talk about the more traditional sustainability implementation tools that are very easily available to you. Let me just remind you that really health and safety protocols at your office, at your building matter a lot. And I would encourage people to go to wellcertified.com, WELL, wellcertified.com. You'll see Lady Gaga there. You'll see J-Lo there. You'll see Robert De Niro there. There is a health and safety protocol that has been put together by medical professionals and building scientists, including myself, that basically will help you if you enroll in the health and safety rating, as Royal Albert Hall has done, as the Empire State Building has done, as the Yankees have done. This will help reduce the immediate public health risks to your colleagues, to your friends, to your family. So that needs to be said, because we are in an extraordinary, the COVID matters. Okay, with regards to climate and other ecological issues, obviously the major ecological issue we face is global climate disruption, the climate crisis. And we're also dealing with species extinction, okay? We're losing 11,000 sharks every hour are slaughtered for their fins for shark fin soup. An elephant is slaughtered every 20 minutes for its ivory. 97% of all the tigers in the world are gone. 90% of all the lions in the world are gone, and half of those that remain are going to be gone in the next 50 years. So we're losing, literally, a species is going extinct every 20 minutes, all right? We are in the Anthropocene, a new geologic era dominated by humanity, and we are wiping out species. We're in a mass extinction, and climate is contributing to this. And by the way, climate disruption also accelerates the spreads of infectious disease. So there is a relationship between the wildlife trade, species extinction, and climate and infectious diseases. So it's all related. Economic health is dependent on human health, and human health is dependent on planetary health. At the organizational level, let me just give you a shortcut concept for what you could do, okay? First thing is you've got to measure, okay? If you don't measure your energy use, if you don't measure the amount of waste you're producing, if you don't measure your water use, how do you know how you're going to improve? How do you measure? What are the categories of measuring? The Global Greenhouse Reporting Index that's used internationally, and I serve on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the steering committee. I deal with climate every day and have been for decades, okay? There's what's called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 impacts, okay? Scope 1 is what your impacts are that you own at your office, at your venue, okay? The boiler that is powering the heat for your building, if you own that building, that's a Scope 1 impact. The cars that you own, that you are driving, that's a Scope 1 impact. If you have machinery at your venue, a diesel generator or whatever, that is a Scope 1 impact. Measure that impact, and as quickly as possible, shift that impact, reduce it. That's number one. Shift it where as much as possible to renewable source, get on wind, get on solar, okay? And what cannot be reduced, then you need credible offsets. And we can talk about offsets, but offsets have evolved. So they are now a viable and necessary tool in managing climate.
If we can just talk about that sort of the Scope 1 position you talked about, perhaps I can ask you about this, Mike. When you were working at, and thanks, Alan, when you were working at Warner Music, Mike, you were looking and did introduce a series of initiatives there that were environmentally focused. I wonder if perhaps you can tell us what you did, but also, did you face, like, I think, without being too cynical, I think everyone looks at this, we can hear these statistics and say, wow, this is terrible. But I think sometimes when you speak to businesses, you sometimes get this feeling that they say, well, this won't make a difference if I just do this, will it? Or there is kind of like, well, or is a case of, well, yeah, okay, but it doesn't really make business sense to do this. So what did you do, and did you face opposition or apathy towards it?
The ultimate changes driven at Warner resulted from an analysis and audit that Alan designed then, very similar to the Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 approach that he's describing now. And what we concluded early on was that we had building and facility related work to do around reduction and offsets. And then at the time, the physical product packaging was the next great area of opportunity. And it was a multi-year effort that ultimately transformed the paper and board packaging in, at the time, all of Warner Music Group's packaging, and ultimately, because these vendors are shared by all of the music companies, it changed the paper and board supply across the industry. And it had a number of really, I mean, it was hard work. We were with our vendors, we had to create the business case for them, including making commitments to get Warner Music's business if you converted to a certain percentage of post-consumer paper and board product. At the same time, we needed to be very active with the artist community for them to understand what it would mean to eliminate the jewel case, right? The interesting thing about the change in physical packaging at the time was that both retailers and consumers perceived the plastic, very dirty plastic jewel case as a much more premium package than board or paper-based packages like today's Digipack. Everybody now knows what a Digipack is, which is one of those foldable cardboard things. Yeah. At the time, that was seen as a much flimsier, cheaper alternative to the precious thing. So it created price pressure for us. And so we were actually working with paper and board suppliers to compete with one another to get their greater share of the business as an incentive to drive to a better source of paper so that we could do the conversion of packaging cost effectively within the supply chain. That was one major element.
So the challenges that you meet are sort of two ways. You have the perception of the public, which I guess is understandably views, they're so used to the plastic jewel cases, they're used to seeing that as the premium product and it's better than paper, which is very debatable. Yeah. But then were you facing challenges? You're facing challenges from the paper suppliers, but were you facing challenge sort of internally in terms of getting this project started? Because why is this a priority for us?
No, I think, as Alan's pointed out, when you have the right collection of folks together, and Alan shares some data, and we may not get into it today, but as an example, I think Alan, and correct me here, the Dow Jones Sustainable Index outperforms the standard Dow Jones, which supports the idea that companies that pay attention to sustainability are just better managed companies generally. And I think, therefore, there's a positive correlation. And in our case, the good fortune of having a John Esposito that was going to drive things through because of relationships that he had inside of the organization as well. You start to find yourself working with folks that just run their businesses better anyway. So I think the internal, let's call it resistance, was really just a matter of education. I don't think folks argued the point. They also clearly, because as a commercial enterprise, you want to know what the financial implications of this were. So that put the added pressure on us to make sure that we could drive the cost out of, at the time, what were going to be premium costing products. People were investing in new types of paper production. The printing had to change. Unfortunately, pure, virgin paper absorbs inks in a way that post-consumer product does not. So there's a lot of innovation and R&D that had to go in, a lot of investment. And so we had to really get the whole supply chain lined up to get behind it. And the carrot that we put out there was, whoever wins that race gets a bigger share of our business, because we want to be able to move quickly on this. And those are the examples. Go ahead. Right. I'm sorry, Alan.
No, when I talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, I'm talking about, measuring the greenhouse gas impacts. But in the case of Warner, Mike Jabara, John Esposito, Edgar Bronfman, they were also very concerned about the upstream habitat and biodiversity and species impact of their supply chain. The paper industry is one of the top global warming pollution industries, okay? It's one of the top industries in terms of contributing to global warming pollution, but it is also one of the top pressures on forests, and it's one of the top consumers of fresh water. So actually, and when I did the first paper use audit at Warner Music Group, they were at 75 Rockefeller Center. They were spending a few $100s per square foot. Every cubicle had its own printer, and each printer was 2 feet by 3 feet. And they literally had hundreds of them. So, it took up a lot of real estate space. That, we redefined the paper budget. Correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but by centralizing printing, by double copying, the double siding, the printers, by going to centralized printers, we saved close to $1 million in a year just on paper reduction costs. And what was interesting is, even though a box of recycled content paper cost more than tree-based paper, because tree-based paper is so heavily subsidized, so much more subsidized than recycled content paper, we were able to actually still plow some of the savings in from reducing toner cartridges, the use of copiers, reducing the amount of paper we're using by double siding. So, there are, pollution is a function of waste. The more waste you produce, the less efficient you are. To Michael's point about the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, companies that are engaged in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index outperform the Dow overall because they are smarter managers. They are paying attention to efficiency enhancements. Energy is a cost. The St. Louis Cardinals, I worked with them, we reduced their energy use by 24%. The Seattle Mariners, the New York Yankees, the Oscars, when we switched to, from diesel generators to fuel cells to solar, we were achieving cost reductions all along the way. At the Staples Center, each urinal was consuming 44,000 gallons of water a year, each urinal. And they had almost 200 urinals at the Staples Center. We changed them all to waterless urinals. They saved $7,000 a month in water costs and 7 million gallons of water a year. So this is also a function of good, efficient business practice.
Yeah.
And I think, Joe, I'm sorry to jump in. I'm going to pull it forward to right now. There are all of the same categories of waste. Maybe it's not on physical packaging, but there are all of these same areas that need to be reviewed, addressed, and innovations and solutions need to be applied in the current music industry. You also, I think in some of our pre-discussion, we talked about the why now. And I think Alan and I and many others would say, well, for us, it's not why now. In fact, as you've heard, Alan's committed his life's work to this, and many of us have stayed on it. It's, I think, understandable that the combination of, let's call it political change over the last 4 years and coronavirus have been distractions for some folks. And if this means that people are now ready and have a moment to take a breath and go back to the most important global imperative that we all have, then we'll celebrate that and we'll say, hey, the window is opened again for the conversation. But I think there are many folks that would say this drumbeat has been going for a long time. It would be a shame if we miss this opportunity now that everybody's refocusing a little bit more on it.
Do you think, Mike, that the music industry, as we sort of intimated at the start, has this incredible resource in terms of people who have the attention of the world? The artists are the huge influencer on people of all age groups across the world. Is this, there are plenty of artists who've been very visible and very vocal in supporting this kind of change. But do you think that there could be more could be done, or do you think it's more of a sort of slow drip process of artists pushing this message out over a long period of time that helps sort of both ends of the chain understand the problem and change with it?
I think part of the education is to equip everyone, artists to operators, with what could we all be doing now? Because you're right. Between, what is it, Alan, parents, then athletes, then entertainers, I think it's in that order, are the most influential or family members on folks' lives. And so we absolutely have folks who care deeply, have very loud voices. We probably haven't equipped artists with all of the tools so that they can speak beyond just their personal experience into how maybe their companies or their labels or their studios or their engineers could be doing things. I'd love to see us take this topic and make sure that from this point forward, every music industry event had this as a theme of programming everywhere, because it impacts everything that we're doing. We shouldn't have another, let's talk about, other Music Ally events or similar. We probably should make sure that we're always using it, if nothing else, as a check-in on how's everybody doing? How are you doing on your analysis? Can we do some best practice sharing? Who's come up with a good way of quantifying or modeling this? That information sharing, I think, will make us all both better citizens and better equipped in our day jobs in the music industry to move this forward.
Right. I mean, we have to get off fossil fuels. Okay. I mean, there's a lot of individual things. Again, as I say, nothing is too small to matter. Everything has to be looked at. That being said, the big picture is we got to get off fossil fuels. We got to stop burning fossil fuels for transportation. We got to stop burning fossil fuels for energy production. We got to shift to renewable sources. Fossil fuels are, if at the end of the day, it results in some kind of flame, you don't want that fuel. So big picture is, in terms of your energy supply for your production, if you're producing music, when you're producing music, get your power from renewable sources. Tell your local utility you want to come from renewable energy sources.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Joe, did you want to say
Well, I
something?
was going to say that sort of brings us on quite neatly to talking about technology, which is something we were sort of bringing the conversation towards.
And Joe, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to put an exclamation point in this, because I think you are rightfully trying to get us to what can each person be doing sooner rather than later, so there isn't paralysis around the subject matter. Just to emphasize what Alan's saying, the UN Secretary General in December was giving kind of a State of the Planet talk at Columbia. And I think, as Alan described, to get to the 1.5°C, rise from pre-industrial, it would require annual reduction in fossil fuel production by 6% a year. We're going to be up 2% this year, right? So we're not only heading in the wrong direction, but we're on a percentage point almost 10% off of where we need to be on a year-on-year. That's only going to happen if each individual takes what Alan just said quite seriously, which is, what am I doing right now to reduce consumption of electricity generated by fossil fuel?
Yeah, and there is a sort of an extra dimension to that, isn't there? When we're talking again about the music business and how we all consume music, there are technologies that we use that we think must be, which we all love, like music streaming, but consume electricity, and we don't know necessarily where that comes from. For example, one example being, the music industry is talking a lot so far this year about NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which are blockchainified virtual items, let's say, to keep that bit short. But anything that relies on the blockchain uses enormous amounts of electricity to generate the calculations that go into producing these items, which seems ridiculous, but it's true. And that's just one example. Music streaming, of course, Mike, as you were saying earlier, involves, again, we think it's easy to think of it as a sort of magic transfer of music from the ether, but it's actually transferring files across to us. Those files have a footprint, and the bigger the files, the more energy used. What can you tell us about, Mike, perhaps we'll start with you. What about that idea that there are sort of areas that we forget about with using technology?
And I want to start with saying we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're going to get consumers comfortable with less, meaning experiences getting worse, quality getting worse. As Alan points out, there's a natural momentum around increase in consumption. And as it relates to the music industry in particular, I think more than ever, we need to be innovating faster and creating more great experiences, because frankly, we're competing with other entertainment categories that have historically outflanked us many times. So I'll start with, let's assume people are always going to want better, more immersive, more engaging as a way of doing it, which means we need to be innovating in every step of the chain. It's why the complete system analysis that Alan's describing is so important. We need to find the opportunities where we can, with a mind toward and an eye toward the fact that we still want there to be great experiences on the back end. When you look at the fact that transportation and electricity production are the two biggest categories of greenhouse gas emissions, every person that's watching this, listening to this, or in the industry has a role in that. It's a very interesting conversation for us to stop and say, well, the lockdown has forced us to work from where we're all sitting right now for the most part. What is it that's going to force us all to jump back on airplanes or in vehicles to travel when we've learned not to? We should probably give a hard look at that, right? The transportation component of the music industry. And then to the point about offsets, there will be live touring again at some point. How will people be able to do that most responsibly so that fans can get to artists, but we can all feel great about the environmental impact of it? As it relates to day-to-day consumption of recorded music, video streaming, you're right, there are a number of different emitters along the way. There's a great effort coming out of Norway right now, if you haven't heard about it yet, Vilvit.io, looking at providing essentially a single central hosting of the music industry's recorded music asset. There's no reason why we have multiple data centers around the world for every DSP holding its own duplicate set of sound recordings for the exact same sound recordings. That's not easy, but it's a clear one, right? And we need to make progress on getting toward that. We should be looking across the entire experience and saying, how do we create? And this is a little bit of an MQA plug, but it quite factually is what MQA can do. How do you create great audio experiences on a smaller electricity and consumption footprint? There are now technologies that can help you do that. And so I think for us, it's breaking down where the mainstream music industry is an emitter and a contributor to that, and having healthy discussion about alternative means. Both reduction, but also transformation through innovation, because we know that people are going to want more and better and faster. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question there.
The evolution of the technology used by the music industry has, diverse impacts. From a climate perspective, Joe, to your point about, the energy consumed, if the energy is coming from solar or wind, if it's coming from a renewable resource, I do a lot of work with the sports industry, and people say, "Oh, we got to eliminate night games because of the lighting." It's not the lights; it's the energy source powering the lights. If those lights were powered by solar that was then stored in a battery and then released at night, there's no greenhouse gas impact. So from the energy perspective, everybody that is making an energy demand in the music industry should identify opportunities for shifting towards renewable. Let me just say, this is not like pardon the pun, not like a light switch that you could turn on and off, okay? If you get to, like the Yankees, we're looking to get to net carbon zero, which means, zero carbon impacts associated with its scope 1 and scope 2 impacts, and I'll tell you what those mean in a second, by 2030, okay? The United Nations is telling us, we have certain milestones. We need to do something by 2030. By 2030, like New York City, you got to have a 40% reduction in your energy use by 2030 in New York City. The Yankees, by the way, have already achieved that. Okay, then we're going to go for another 50% reduction. By 2050, the whole planet has to be off fossil fuels at net carbon zero. Okay, that is the United Nations goal. Okay, we got to be at, and actually we need to get more trees in there. People talk about, carbon capture technologies. They're called trees.
Trees, yeah.
Okay, so we need to, get, protect our forests, reforest, and get off fossil fuels, whether it's for plastic making or for energy. So it's not the specific technological device, it's how is that device powered. Now, as it concerns the construction of that device, yes, there's mining impacts, there's forestry impacts, there's habitat impacts, there's water impacts, there's environmental justice impacts, there's toxic air emissions, there's waste generations. So we do need to, like when we work with Warner, we were looking in, and now more than ever, I'm working with John Esposito down at the Nashville offices, and we're focused more than ever on greenhouse gases. The nearest danger is the greatest danger. We're trying to get them to net carbon zero, like ASAP, and they're going to get there. But at the same time, those, plastic CD cases that we were trying to switch, they were a composite of two known, ethylene and benzene, two known carcinogens based on fossil fuels. So we wanted to get out of that particular type of material as quickly as possible because of the upstream impacts. So, by the way, I mentioned scope 1 impacts from a greenhouse gas impact. What's on your site? Scope 2 is what you buy over the fence, the energy you buy over the fence. When you contract with a utility to power your office, to power your production, your music production facility, you want to be getting it from renewable resources, from solar or wind. Okay.
So, Alan, in that regard, when you work with companies like Warner to transition to this kind of energy production, is it easy? Is it something you can? I presume that you're working with people who want to do this, right? So, how easy is it in a structural way to say, right, this big company, multinational company which has all these connections we have lots of different offices, we subcontract out to recording studios and blah blah blah, that we're going to get all of this onto renewable energy. How does that process begin? Is it really difficult or not?
Yeah. Look, an organization is the shadow of its leadership. Okay. So, an organization is the shadow of its leadership. If you've got Esposito or Jabaro or Bronfman or, a Hal Steinbrenner at the Yankees or, Bud Selig at baseball, if they say this matters to them, then, the institution moves in that direction. But remember, the ruthlessness of the market does not go away because you have good intentions, okay? So we have to outcompete the bad stuff. Now, I do work with a lot of people who, actually get it. They understand it. You don't get to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation because you're stupid, okay? The bottom line is you have to pay attention to, good, generally accepted accounting principles. You have to pay attention to science. Science is not just another opinion. Okay, There are scientific methods, okay? And so when I work with, I mostly work at, at very high levels, in terms of, leadership of organizations. And these folks get it. But there are folks, I mean, I've had people say to me, well, I've had some people tell me to go somewhere, but I've had people say, Alan, I know by looking at you that I disagree with everything you stand for, but you're saving me money. So I'm going to work.
Now, I think this is an interesting point, perhaps, because we're sort of running out. I mean, I feel like we could talk on for hours and hours on this, and maybe we should sometime. But to sort of bring it to the end of this part, I'd like to talk about that quite specifically, that business opportunity part, because, when we get down to brass tacks, this is what's going to drive a large part of the decision making. So, Mike, perhaps we can come to you first. When we look forward now, and we're looking at this transition to a better, sustainable, environmentally correct way of doing things, what are those business opportunities? I mean, I'm not asking you to suggest specific ones, perhaps, but what are the kind of business opportunities that people just can't see that exist by doing it?
I think in our industry, and someone said this to me recently really well, that they don't understand that the purchasing power of the demographic the industry is trying to appeal to includes a new value set that includes a sustainability profile. So I think it's more getting in touch with the customer and recognizing this is already out there as a requirement. So the business opportunity is competition as well as improved margins and business results that Alan just described. For the most part, right, I don't think folks have connected the dots between that value. And maybe that's going back to your earlier question, Joe. Yeah. That's how we get the artist community there, is to help mobilize what would be a very vocal consumer base to start to express more explicitly, I'm going to vote based on my values, and this is one of my values. Yeah. I know that we tend to, in our industry, talk about other things. What's a great example? There's been a lot of discussion about the pay through to artists. Yes. And those services that attract customers because they read that they do a better job of compensating artists. Well, sustainability should be part of that same kind of conversation. Who are the most responsible companies? Why am I not choosing to buy my music service from them based on that? I think those are the kind of things that push buttons in all directions. The consumers are activists, the companies have to compete, they have to react. And ultimately, those that don't get it on day one will eventually get it because they're going to see the commercial and financial return from stepping.
It's a great point, Mike, because if we look, for instance, at Taylor Swift's power over her fans, for example, she's re-recording her songs and re-releasing them on the understanding that her fans will listen to those ones and not the other ones because she believes that she's convinced them that's the right thing to do. Well, it's not a massive logical leap for her to start doing what you've just described, is it?
I'd argue that sustainability is an entirely different class of justification than her reasons, but yes, I get your point.
You get my point. On the influential scale, if she can influence them to do that, then she can convince them that this is a really important thing, can't she? And so can all the other stars. Alan, same question to you, really. The business opportunities of doing this that perhaps people can't see.
Well, first of all, remember that investors are increasingly looking for environmentally, that the companies they invest in are environmentally responsible. People do not want to be associated with companies that are killing tigers and, raising the temperature of the climate. Also, certain regulatory agencies. If you're a publicly traded company in the United States, you are regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and you have to report your environmental liabilities. And if you don't, you're penalized. So there's increasing government regulation that is requiring reporting. Throughout Europe, I mean, as you know, you actually have to, measure and report your greenhouse gases. And consumers are increasingly asking about, surveys have been done. Look, the climate movement in particular is being led, by young people who surveys have been done. They are assuming companies are environmentally responsible. And if they find out that you're not, they're shocked. And remember, right now, the global climate movement, the most visible person in the global climate movement right now in the world is a 17-year-old girl. Extinction Rebellion or Sunrise Movement or, 350.org. Yeah. These are organizations that are, run by young people, and these are the consumers. When I had a meeting with Bill Ford, about, moving towards electric vehicles, it was amazing because they interview 13-year-old kids. Why? Because it takes 5 years to retool, to redesign, retool an assembly line. And those 13-year-old kids, by the time the car comes online, are going to be 18 years old.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again,
It makes, it makes the music industry seem like a natural fit, really, doesn't it? If you've got a bunch of very influential and highly motivated teenagers, well, the music industry is their sort of natural home. They're artists they love, and they could find the route forward. And I think if there's one thing the music industry is good at, it's listening to teenagers who dictate what they want to do and what they want to listen to, isn't it?
I mean, we need a cultural shift. And, I don't know when people are going to view this, a particular interview, this conversation, in the future. But let me just say that we are now speaking in the second week of February in 2021. And 57 years ago, just yesterday, the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan. I was watching that show, frankly, as a young boy. And even, I remember going into class the next day and the world changed. Everything changed. Clothing changed. Our hairstyles changed. Our relationships with our families changed. Everything changed. Music, I mean, when you think of, again, as Michael said, outside of the family, the most influential role models are athletes and entertainers. Why do businesses, last year they spent over $40 billion on advertising in sports and entertainment? Why are they doing that? Because they think that sports and entertainment can shape the culture of the marketplace and shape cultural expectations and attitudes about consumption and behavior. So yeah, I mean, and look, if you're wasting energy, you're burning up money. If you're wasting water, you're burning up money. If you're throwing away more waste that has to be managed, you're wasting your money. And remember, ultimately, nature is the ultimate source of all economic value. Without clean air, without clean water, there are cricket matches being canceled because of excessive heat. There are, sports events. Every music production facility in the world, every single one of them, and every office of a music company is in a community that is being affected now by global climate disruption. It's happening now, okay? And, you've got situations where people, the temperature goes up where some of these items are produced, where flooding is happening, temperatures are happening, people can't go to work. And of course, as we, and the climate crisis is actually contributing to a spread of infectious diseases. We are finding that more and more vehicles, transmitters of infectious diseases are spreading to other areas because of the rise in global temperatures. We're starting to see, infections happening in areas that it never happened before. So this is all related. Again, economic health is, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think it's a good place to sort of wrap up, really, because we've got there's clearly an understanding now, or hopefully an enhanced understanding, perhaps particularly after the last year we've just had under coronavirus, of how intimately we individually and businesses are affected by the world. And also there is an element of hopefulness there, bringing the Beatles into the equation, but the young enthusiasm can actually drive this change and be the force behind it, even if it appears that the business is reacting to them, which is great, isn't it? Listen, I would love to carry on talking about this all day, but we do have, well, we have to let you go and we've got to bring someone else on. So again, hate to wrap it up so quickly, but Mike Jabara from MQA, thank you ever so much for joining us. And very grateful for your help in putting this panel together, and I hope to speak to you again soon. And Dr. Alan Hershkowitz, real pleasure, and to hear your such enthusiasm and the information and data and putting it in context. But again, we're really grateful. So thank you both very much for joining us, and I hope to have you on again soon. Yeah, thank you both, and we will be writing about this a little more on Music Ally throughout the year coming ahead. Now, Patrick, my erstwhile colleague, is about to join me on the screen shortly, and he'll be bringing with him Chiara Badiali from Julie's Bicycle. And while he does that, hello, Chiara, hi, nice to see you. And Patrick, hello there. Thank you for joining us, Chiara. Now, if anyone out there does have a question, by the way, I was going to jump in and ask people to put questions to Mike and Alan, but there was a lot to take on board there. I don't know if we would have had time to put any to them. But this section where we're talking to Chiara, is hopefully is again answering that question about, okay, how do I start immediately? So for clarity, Julie's Bicycle helps to mobilize climate action in the arts and music, bringing people together around shared issues and helping them take practical steps to reduce emissions and impacts. They are essentially, your organization, Chiara, is set up to answer that question. How do I get started? Now, I sort of encourage you to, watching, to have a look at what Julie's Bicycle does. I think we're going to share some links in the chat now. But essentially, Chiara, I'd like to jump straight forward to saying, right, okay, this is a thing greeted, environmental sustainability is greeted with enthusiasm. As Mike and Alan said, you work with good people at the top, they want to make change. But where do they start? Well, you must hear that question all the time. How do you answer it?
I do. And I mean, the first answer is just start. You know, wherever you can, just start, and things will start falling into place once you start taking action. And you might not have all the answers when you set out, but we are talking about kind of retooling the way that we work in such a short period of time. And we're not going to have all the answers before we get going. We will raise more questions, we'll probably make mistakes, but that is not a reason not to do something. And so I guess the way I like to think about how you take action as a company or as an individual working in the music industry is, one is looking at and having a credible plan for reducing the emissions from how you work. Two is looking a bit out there at behaviour change. So, for example, here in the UK, the Committee on Climate Change, who gives advice to the UK government and what we have to do, they estimate that around 2/3 of the emissions reductions we have to achieve in the UK are going to require some kind of change in how people live. And there is a huge opportunity there for us to role model those shifts in our own spaces, and sort of, you know, influencing and nudging people. And the two focus areas there are around travel and what people eat. And the third is kind of our influence and our voice out there. So, you know, how do we help create and push political will and ambition? How do we get involved in campaigns? How do we do really practical things like, you know, voter registration drives, things like that. So getting people really involved and engaged in how we shape that future. So on that, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think? I mean, I mean, I think your advice of just start is actually something that the music industry should just understand instinctively, isn't it? Because is that not the ethos of the industry in general? It's like, why we'll just get out there and do it, and, you know, to quote Wayne's World, book them and they will come. But do you think that given the year we've just had with coronavirus, where it's caused people to completely, without talking about the sort of destruction it's had or on the live industry, where people are completely reevaluating their life, do you think that maybe this might spur people into looking how to do things differently?
I think it is. I think it's what it's done. You know, in terms of global emissions, it's barely caused a blip. So we're still despite all these changes that have happened, we're still a really long way from where we need to be. But I think what it has done for all of us is kind of illustrated how quickly we can change when we need to. And I kind of take heart in that. It's you know, when we have to, we can get stuff done, and, you know, you can move mountains, you can be super, super creative.
Yeah. And, you know, like you say, it's the way that we've adapted as a society is kind of inspiring in a way, although it took something to force us to do that. And what we want to do, obviously, with environmental change, sustainability, is not be. We are being forced to do it, but we don't want to be sort of, you know, being physically forced to do it. So when, you know, you've worked with Patrick has just put a couple of case studies of Julie's Bicycles in the chat. Ninja Tune, for example, and Opera North, both based in the UK. So, for example, if we can talk about the Ninja Tune example, when you sat down with them and they said we wanted to, and they've been very vocal in their desire to become environmentally sustainable, and they said, right, we want to do something, and you say, right, let's just start by doing this. What with a company like that, what are their immediate starting points?
So, I mean, one thing I'd say about Ninja Tune is I think for us, we kind of help people on the way, but also they have done a huge amount sort of off their own backs as well, that or like, I don't want to independently sort of take credit for either. I think
Sure.
Peter and also Matt Black, they've been kind of there, you know, trying to create a company that sort of aligns with their values and beliefs. But, you know, with any company, when we sit down, the first is sort of, we go through 3 principles. One is around commitment. So it's, you know, have you put in place the systems to actually see this through? And that means not just leaving it voluntarily with someone who has to find like free time in between their other responsibilities, but it's like, have you given someone the responsibility and have you given them the resources to actually push this through? Second area is around understanding. So again, I think Alan already referred to this. You start by measuring. You can only start managing stuff if you're measuring it. So one thing that we offer is actually a free carbon calculator called the Creative Green Tools that we developed together with the music industry really early on to give everyone, including small companies who probably can't access or necessarily the paid services of a consultancy, a way to make that beginning. And the only thing that you need to use those carbon calculators, you create an account, you have your electricity bills and your gas bills to hand, you know, you keep track of your business travel, things like that, you plug it in and it'll give you a number, and that's a starting point. There's also something about learning. So creating opportunities for the people who work at your company to get to grips with like, what is the issue, and you know, what matters, what's going to make the biggest difference, what do I do? And sort of having that training, we need to really upskill actually the whole workforce of the music industry, you know, from managers, from people who negotiate sponsorship agreements, from people who run and manage venues. I think we're a long way from having that skill set necessarily of knowing like, what am I going to do? And we need to get there, and we need to get there really, really quickly.
When you in businesses like this, I mean, we were talking before about how, you know, with big businesses, actually their interests are driven by sort of teenagers who want change, and they might say, well, look, we only want to work with these industries that have environmentally friendly policies. When you work on a business level, is that desire for change often driven by, does it take a consensus within the industry of lots of people there saying, look, sort of pointing upwards to management saying that we want this change, we want to be part of this, can you give us the tools to do it? And it becomes is that often the way it starts?
I think it starts both ways. Sometimes it's bottom up and sometimes it's top down, and in the end you need both things to make a change happen. And a lot of the time, you know, we work sometimes with really big businesses and sometimes with smaller businesses as well. So one example would be festival energy provision here in the UK. So way back in the annals of time, probably about 10 years ago now, after we did our first bit of research that showed, you know, for festivals, actually the diesel use in generators is a big area of impact. And from that, we had a brilliant guy called Chris Johnson, one of the founders of Shambhala Festival. He sort of started thinking, okay, how do I power my festival with renewables? And we sort of got together with Chris and we started a group called Powerful Thinking. And we brought various different stakeholders from the festival industry around the table. We started doing things like generator monitoring, just to show how, because everyone adds a margin to the size of the generators, you end up with these generators that are like 2-3 times the size that they need to be. You're wasting an absolute ton of fuel because of the ways that we're working. And there's no clear pathway either to like how we start shifting to renewables. And so, you know, within that group for the past 10 years, we've been kind of helping sort of do more monitoring projects, share case studies of events that have taken action back into the whole community. And as well within that, you know, you have smaller events that can take more risks and sort of try out new technologies. And then you have the big events like Festival Republic, who can really make a difference in terms of driving that investment and going back to suppliers and saying, actually, you know, we want LED festoon. So if you want the contract next year, you're going to have to invest in that. And then that makes those more energy efficient technologies available to other people. So you need everyone really in the music ecosystem, from the big companies to the small companies, from, you know, your person who's sort of working at an operational level to the leaders to be talking about this and to want to drive change forward.
But again, it does seem like it needs someone to stick their neck out and say, right, we want to switch to LED lighting, and you know, we'll put that out to tender, and we'll only consider people who can provide that, to force change. And when you ask people to stick their neck out, you know, I mean, that's an amazing thing to do, and you know, but it's really hard, understandably, I think, for some people to say, well, it's that sort of pragmatic opposition. People who say, look, I'd love to do that, but it won't work with my business model. I can't get this past the board, or the product just won't be as good. Which I'm sure you've met that sort of kind opposition a lot. How do you get around that?
I mean, meet it all the time. I think the thing to do is to go back to like, what's driving this change? One, we have a huge ethical imperative about, life on Earth, both locally and the impacts that are already being felt, internationally, the impacts that are being felt, especially in countries that are much less responsible for the emissions that we put in there. And sort of, we have to come to grips with this. There is no alternative. Ultimately, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's also kind of legislation that helps drive change. Sometimes that's stronger, sometimes it's not as strong as we'd like it to be. But in theory, we have an international climate agreement under which every country, including the UK, has agreed to ambitious reduction targets. And that starts filtering through into policy. So there is a real incentive for us to be ahead of that as an industry as well. And also now, local authorities are declaring climate emergencies left, right, and centre. What does it mean for a festival to be compliant with a declaration of climate emergency? Are we ready for that? That is a really big driver. And then lastly, again, it's sort of our audiences and the people who work in the industry. I think there has been over the last few years a strange silence that's developed around this. Like, a lot of people are worried about climate change and they feel quite isolated, and they feel like no one else cares. But there is more people in that position than there is people who don't care. So I think it's remembering that. So what we found when we work with different companies, actually, people are much happier because everyone wants to work for a company that's doing the right thing on climate. And like, where, you get given permission to care about climate change and to drive that forward. And same thing again with audiences. This is such a big issue now. We can't not be active on it.
We saw last year, I'm drawing comparison with two quite different things, but we saw with the movement around Black Lives Matter that, especially at a company level across the world, and particularly in the music industry, was driven by consensus of people there saying, we want change, we insist on change, and they have started to force through change. And that was fantastic. And that sort of sets a precedent for what can be done when there's enough people who care about something that's really, really important to make change happen, isn't there? And when you deal with the music industry, of course, you do have this extra magnifying effect that the music industry, it can be a rallying point for all those people who feel atomized, who feel like, I'm terrified about what's happening to the planet, but what difference does it make if I change my light bulbs? Is that something that you sense, and from the people you've worked with, you've seen that the industry is, we've seen music declares an emergency, right? Which I think you're part of, as I remember. Yes. And what sort of development will there be there, do you think, in using that power, that unique power over people that music has, to help rally people and unify them in a way that is, incredibly effective, but also sort of enjoyable?
Yeah, I think all of this is about giving people courage in some ways, courage to step out and to take action. So again, one of the key reasons behind Music Declares Emergency is to make visible. It's like, you have all these artists who care and you have all these companies who care. And that should be giving confidence to people who work in the industry as well to take more action and more courageous action. And then in terms of, audiences and kind of out there conversations, I think some of this is just normalizing that that concern, but particularly for an artist to feel comfortable to like step out there and speak out, and that's where Julie's Bicycle came from originally. Like, there is a bit of discomfort to be like, you're an artist, therefore you have to speak out on climate change, especially if there is not an industry that then has your back in terms of also changing the way that we do business. And so a lot of the work that we do is really about how do we create that scaffolding around artists so that they can go out there and they can speak out in confidence if they choose to, knowing that there is an industry that is working towards reducing its own emissions, and that has got their backs basically, and that also knows what, so and also that that people who work in the industry know what they're talking about as well. So, for example, if you are talking about a new advertising deal or a sponsorship deal, that someone who is negotiating that understands, like, actually, you know, these companies we should probably steer away from today because they're quite high risk in terms of the climate change debate. But you need the people in the music industry to be involved in these discussions, to be able to make that guidance and to help people in that way and to support artists in that way.
Well, what's clear is that the changes that are making an impact are incremental. That it requires across the board change. It requires across the board action, and so this is a sort of uniquely difficult challenge, but one that you can't not deal with. In that it's one that we all have to be part of. We have to somehow feel motivated. We want to connect with artists that we care about and love, who like you say, we feel that they've got our backs. We feel that they're helping other people. The artists feel like the industry's got their backs, and they won't be sort of hung out to dry as soon as someone takes a photograph of them doing something unenvironmentally sound. You know, there's so many. Everyone has to move forward at once, and that kind of change is very hard to visualize for everybody involved: businesses, artists, individuals, whatever. How do you? I mean, this is a tricky one, but how do you overcome that? You were saying visibility is really important, but how do you give people the impression that this change is happening and making people feel that they have the agency and something is happening?
I think, again, it's sort of breaking it down into the actions and into the areas where change needs to happen. I mean, at its heart, sort of climate change comes back to energy use, and it comes to land use, like how we use land. And that sort of translates in different ways across the music industry. So, you know, with festivals, the focus areas really are, how do we get festivals off of diesel generators and onto battery technology, renewable energy, mains grid connections. Audience travel is another really big one for festivals. And so there it becomes, okay, how do you incentivize people to get out of cars into public transport? Do we need to plan for a future where we might have to change where we hold some of these big events as well, so that they're, you know, actually accessible through public transport, through electric cars? And then food is sort of another kind of area around festivals, which is the opportunity around that sort of behavior change and exposing people to, you know, a diet that has less meat in it. But
festivals are a great opportunity to do that, aren't they? I mean,
yeah, they are.
Anyone who's been to Glastonbury will be aware of the multiple different options that are pushed, specifically pushed as being better options to you.
Yeah, and you know, you have events that are making statements around that as well. Like Shambhala went fully meat and fish free, as like, we need to start a conversation about what we eat. And then you've got on the venue side, again, venues really is about the power that's used in the venues. That's a really big one. Can we shift over to renewable electricity, either by buying renewable electricity or installing, you know, their own solar panels and renewable energy sort of installations? Again, for venues, audience travel, again, another big one, and food. So those are the kinds of things that we work through. If you're looking at a record label, there's sort of the office side, and then there's the manufacturing side. Again, on the manufacturing side, how do we shift all of that manufacturing to renewable energy? And then on the office side as well, same thing. How do we power our offices through renewables? Again, Ninja Tune has done great stuff there, both in terms of shifting to suppliers like Good Energy, who provide, you know, 100% renewable electricity, and actually installing their own solar panels as well. And then I
guess that there's by, for example, like talking about record labels, for instance, you know, the one way of looking, big picture way of looking at this is, if a record label is very openly for this kind of renewable energy, it could be the tipping point between bringing an artist in who would have gone somewhere else because they like their environmental policies. That artist could be a huge success. They could then spread the message. I mean, it's a ripple effect, isn't it, of intention. When we talk about, you mentioned there using batteries at festivals instead of diesel generators, which are ubiquitous at festivals, you know, the hum all night if you've camped in the wrong place. What we're seeing at the moment is the price of batteries plummet, and the efficiency and usability of batteries also increase at the same time, which is standard practice in any kind of technological development. We hear the phrase tipping point a lot in when we talk about environmental things, often the wrong type of tipping point. But do you think there will be this kind of, I'm putting myself in the place of a small festival owner, and they're saying, well, look, our margins are so small anyway. Now I have to invest in all these batteries to make this work. do you think there's going to be a tipping point where the prices make sense, the intention makes sense, and the loudness, the pressure from consumers gets loud enough to say, okay, I will make that change?
For sure. And, I think in some cases that tipping point is already there, but people aren't necessarily measuring it in the same way. So when you compare like the cost of a diesel generator, quite often people are comparing the cost of renting the diesel generator to the cost of renting a battery. And they forget about the cost of the fuel that's going to have to go into the diesel generator, but you don't have to spend on the battery. So but sometimes there's misalignment in how we make those calculations even now. But there is also, and that tipping point though, it is coming. So there is, if we meet our climate targets, there is no future within which we will still be powering outdoor events.
Yeah.
Or construction sites, for that matter, with diesel generators. And that means there is a really clear trajectory on that. We are waiting for some policy signals, for example, from the UK government to push that along. And, again, what's interesting about different parts of the music industry is some supply chain parts are really specialized, like CD packaging. But when it comes to stuff like outdoor event power supply, you're also talking about what's happening in the construction industry. So sometimes you benefit from these other industries of scale and being able to import that technology almost into our sector, but vice versa as well. What the opportunity of the music community is that experimentation too. So there is a great project at the moment, an EU-funded project, which is trialing hydrogen fuel generators at festival sites because they're kind of using them almost as laboratories for trialing out the technology. And so seeing more of those projects into the future, I think, is one of the things I'd love to see.
Yeah.
One of the questions I actually had, being an artist manager and also, thinking of working with a lot of young artists who overwhelmed, I would say, is how a lot of them feel, and they make music with songs that sort of like talk to these themes. But I mean, and I think it's wonderful that we're talking a lot of sort of like systemic industry change that can help them, move into that. But coming as an artist who's trying to get a deal and, trying to get people to pay attention, but also heartbreaking because of what's going on with the environment, is there anything you would sort of to that side of it, of what artists can do to step up, not look foolish, and really, make a difference and rally around this?
Yeah, and I think there it'll depend on like where you are in terms of your career level and understanding the power that you have for negotiating within that. I think, if you're quite an A-list big name artist, there are different things that you could already be doing to help push that bigger change that's going to benefit everyone. So one thing that we talk about a lot is this idea of green riders. But really that should go into tour planning from start to finish. It's like actually at the moment where you're having the conversation with a potential venue that you might play at is this venue powered by renewables? Like, what is your waste and recycling policy? How good are your public transport connections? Like, what's your vegetarian and vegan food offering like? And so that already at that point where you're negotiating those dates, the agent sort of collects some of that info, key info for the venues. And as you're choosing, like, I'm going to go with this venue over this one, you have that information to feed into it almost. If you're an artist who's kind of more at the beginning of a career, there's still nothing stopping you from, if you are in a conversation with a label, for example, just asking, like, actually out of curiosity, like, what are your policies on this? And they might not know, but it starts creating that sense of there is interest on this. Because one of the things I hear most often from venues, labels, festivals is like, well, we would make this change, but to be honest, we're just not sure the artists care, or like the artists are going to be on board for it. And the thing I hear most often from sort of artist management side is, well, we want to do all this stuff, but like it really depends on the labels and the venues and the festivals. So no one or that conversation isn't happening enough yet. So that would be my one thing to say, like, just bring it up, have that chat.
Do you think that to sort of, as we're sort of reaching the end of this bit, Chiara, unfortunately, but I mean, we spoke earlier about having a big artist. I sort of hypothetically named Taylor Swift, but Patrick's talking about emerging artists as well. The artists do have negotiating power to make these changes. They can make a difference. And do you think that, do you talk to artists in this sense and say, and sort of persuade them to start being more vocal. I'm trying to think about if I was an artist, which of course I'm not, but I can imagine there being pushback in the past on these things and people sort of rolling their eyes. But now can you get people to stick their neck out and say, right, I'm going to only play venues that promise renewable energy, and I'm going to ask everyone else I know to do this, and I'm going to tell my fans I'm doing it?
I think we're just before the tipping point of that happening. I think we're gonna see a few commitments like that, I think, coming up. There have been a few, like Radiohead did it on one of their US tours like 13, 14 years ago, where for the venues that weren't already on renewable energy tariffs, like they made them buy renewable energy certificates to cover the energy use of that night, for example, and they did a whole bunch of other stuff on that tour. Like they made one of the lighting companies develop a bespoke LED light so that they could shift their stage lighting around. So I think we will see more of that. I think in the past there's been a bit more of a fear of like artists who want to do the right thing behind the scenes but are almost scared if someone finds out, and then that sense of, I know this is the right thing to do, but actually I don't want to get asked about it in interviews because I don't want to be, the climate artist, or like, I'm not sure that I would then know how to follow up on it. It's just, someone's told me it's the right thing to do, so I'm going to do it. And I think as the conversation out there has shifted, I think that fear is starting to go away now, because the climate conversation is so much more out there. That it's much easier to go back and say, you can call me a hypocrite all you want, but at least I'm trying to do something here.
And to put my sort of slightly ruthless industry head on, if you say to an artist like Ed Sheeran, to hypothetically pick a name, if you take this as an agenda that you make public and you make it part of your holistically part of your next album and your tour and what you communicate, that is a clear marketing opportunity to 16-year-olds who hang on Greta Thunberg's every word and because they believe in it and they want it. That is a clear marketing advantage, isn't it? And why would you not do that?
Yeah, and again, I think it's starting to happen. Like they haven't happened this summer, sadly, but the 1975 were looking to do a whole bunch of stuff together with Live Nation and Finsbury Park around this. So I think that the conversations are happening and it is moving. And it's just about how we really embed it and don't just bounce back into old habits as we start coming out of lockdown.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've run over here, and I'm very grateful that you've hung around as we've sort of pursued the path on this one. So let's wrap it up. But Chiara, I mean, Patrick has shared a bunch of links to Julie's bicycle in the chat, including the reporting portal thing that you mentioned earlier. For people who are watching and they're thinking, okay, right, I am motivated to start right now. What should they do? Whether that's going to Julie's bicycle or doing something else.
Yeah. So. One area, there's a load of top tips that we pulled together and wrote for the Music Declares Emergency website for like different parts of the sector. So go to the Music Declares emergency.net and have a look at the actions bit. Go to the Julie's Bicycle website. Like we have loads of free sort of resources and guides and stuff on the Julie's Bicycle website as well. If you want to talk about sort of more bespoke consultancy, drop me a line or drop info@juliesbicycle.com a line, and we can talk about what that looks like. And I think those are your starting points.
And then, like you say, people can just go ahead and do it, which is a great starting point for anything. Chiara, thank you ever so much. We're really grateful, and I hope to have you, same as with Mike and Alan, back involved. Perhaps on a show or in some way on Music Ally in the future, and perhaps we can check in and see how things are going in maybe 6 to 12 months time and see if changes have happened. That would be something really powerful, I think, as well. So thank you for joining us. Now, Patrick, before I let you give the hard sell on Music Ally, I want to point out that we do have a new free weekly newsletter, The Knowledge, which is run by Music Ally, and you can sign up for free, and you can get must-read news from the bulletin, insights from our Learning Hub, marketing tips from the Sandbox, and other goodies. And we will share a link in. Oh, Patrick has already shared a link in the chat. So that's about it, Patrick. Anything else you want to share from a Music Ally perspective, or are we good to go?
From a Music Ally perspective, we just want to say thanks, Joe, for being an excellent host once again. Thank you, everyone that's tuned in, and hopefully we'll be talking to you more about this more.
Wonderful. Thanks, Patrick. Thank you all for watching and for joining us again, and hope to see you soon. Enjoy the weekend. Goodbye.